my name is Trolls and welcome to Soundpaint. In this video tutorial we're gonna go super deep into our Juniper 8, also known as the Juniper 8 or the King of Polysynthesizers. And the name King of Polysynthesizers should not be underestimated. There are thousands, tens of thousands of synthesizers out there that each have their own characters and beautiful aspects to them. But when it comes to these old vintage synthesizers, each of them degrade in different ways. Some like fine wine, a few others not so much. In this case, one of the most pristinely well-kept Juniper 8s in the world. Everything is really, truly like the synthesizer was back in the day. But on top of all that, we can also sprinkle some extra magic in the sense that this was Junkie XL's old Juniper 8. He was lucky enough to buy it from Michael Sembello, who wrote the famous Maniac track from Flashdance on it. In fact, most of Flashdance was written on this unit. Check this one out. So we are truly looking at music history at our fingertips here, a preservation of oscillators. And with these old units, they are different. There's noise in them, they're a little bit unstable, they detune in a very unique way that is hard to emulate in software. There's so many small things because they're actual old school chipsets for everything that goes on in it. All that in its sweet orchestration just creates a very, very different sound, and it sits different in the mix. It's not as big as a lot of the modern synthesizers, but it sits a lot better in the mix. And I think that's one of the reasons a lot of us are appreciating some of the older recordings from the 80s, 70s, because they were using these instruments and they are more instruments in a classic acoustic sort of sense. And I really, truly see these instruments on par with the greatest of acoustic instruments. This is reflected in the fact that we have two different versions of this library. We have a UDS version, which stands for ultra deep sampling. This is an evolution of a concept I created many years ago called deep sampling, which was inspired by the Deepwater Horizon scandal in Texas and so forth. But I was trying to find a word that would encapsulate us going deeper into sampling. But in the case of ultra deep sampling, we've taken it a step further. I don't want to emulate or simulate. I want to offer the full, true experience of sitting there with the unit. And I'm actually building it for myself because as these old vintage units sit there and get older, sometimes they don't sound as well, sometimes they go out of tune. So I want to do my best to preserve these sonic souls at the deepest state possible, so I always have access to it in my computer. Ultra deep sampling means that every time you click the same key on the synthesizer, it's going to generate a different version of that key. This is known as round robin in traditional sampling, but in this case here, we went super deep on it. Any type of bass you can imagine, pad imaginable, super fat leads, motion picture arpeggiators, effects, drum kits, noises. We even went down and did raw oscillator recordings as well. You also get analog clicks if you want to add that to it. But with ultra deep sampling, it's super cool when you play fast or with repeated chords because they never sound totally the same. This also becomes more apparent when you use an arpeggiator. If you play the repeated notes or repeated chords as well, you hear that natural variation. It just breathes better in the music. So ultra deep sampling is for those of us who are really seriously nerdy into exquisite production where we really capture every single note in their variable state as well. But other than that, the UDS version and the standard versions are completely identical. You get the same programs, the same parts, all of that stuff. It's just with those repeated notes. Also something that's really difficult to emulate in software because there's a level of complexity in these units. Every single electrical component is speaking to each other. Bob Moog described this so beautifully as being able to hear the electrons pass through the circuitry. And with ultra deep sampling, we're a little bit closer to that. It really feels like sitting there with the unit. But anyway, that's me talking about it. I would so much rather have that the instrument talks than me. I prepared a variety of mini demos here. I'll do my very best to present it in the luxury spotlight that it deserves. So without further ado, this is the Juniper 8. And that's in part what's coming from the analog state variable filter here. You'll notice down here I'm moving my cutoff and resonance associated to my mod wheel. Also that we got a little bit of extra analog set up here in the filter. So there's a slight amount of micro variation in the filter behavior. One of the things that totally blew me away when I was sampling the Juniper 8 was the fact that Sometimes it's not just a synthesizer. Sometimes it emits sounds that are more like acoustic instruments, which really took me by surprise. In this case here, imagine like a really aggressive sort of brass symphony, really punchy, bright, brassy kind of sound, but sounds kind of like the real deal, kind of. Oh my god, I gotta stop. There's too many sounds to show. When you notice the same note here, it's never really the same, and it gives it that quality when you play repeated notes. And just nice analog randomness, the stuff that we just can't fully understand in terms of emulating software. This is what happens when millions of different electrons are banging into each other inside of old circuitry. It's also a mean bass. And in this one here, you'd imagine that's a filter, but it's not. In Soundpaint, we have a very special equalizer. I like to sometimes use it in terms of associating and giving frequency to my mod wheel here, highlighting frequencies. It's sort of like a filter, but not really. Another bubbly sound from the old days. A little bit of shimmer on the tail. Such a beautiful sound. Let me just remove the shimmer here for a second. It's so nice to play the same note. Not get the same note every time. It's hard to describe because it may not sound like a lot, but when you put multiple instruments together that all have that behavior, that's when the music starts singing. Just a little bit of LFO love. Notice on my mod wheel here that it's associated to the frequency here of the LFO. One of the things that the Jupiter 8 is most known for is its beautiful wide stereo sounding pads. In this case here, I just felt like George Michael. Isn't that Phat perfection? And that's another good example of the repeated notes. It just feels like a real analog because it's not the same, it's alive. Also check out this beautiful classic 80s pad. It's also super cool for hybrid-like instruments. Imagine somewhere between a Rhodes and an old Chick Corea sort of solo synthesizer. And if you notice, there's a little bit of noise in the sound. That's nice. That's coming from the unit. That's what they sound like. And too many, and myself included, have wasted our time in the past by noise reducing these units. Some of the most beautiful aspects, those higher transients, are up here. It's also super good at bell-like sounds. It's also one of the meanest solo synthesizers ever made. Check this one out here. Look for the feedback in the sound as well. It's that real. There's so much grindiness in the distortion. It's not some cookie cutter perfect synthesizer. This is alive, it's breathing, it wants to tell me a story. I've sequenced a little mini example here that combines the arpeggiator with the lead synthesizer. I just want to show that in context to each other. I think that lead synthesizer for me has a very close quality to that of an electric guitar, equally expressive and with all sorts of highlights in the sound. And that was just 3 Jupiter 8s put together. But you hear how musical that was? The Arp constantly having variation in the notes, the distorted lead synthesizer having so many human-like qualities, the beautiful Phat bass behind it. This is what this instrument is about. I often say that it's fat in the bottom and it's bright on the top. And that's the best way I can describe the sonic uniqueness of the Jupiter 8. I also sequenced this other example here with a Plucked synthesizer. It almost has like flute-like qualities to it. It's so beautiful in my opinion, and you're gonna hear that analog noise surrounding it as well. Also totally dig it for those old, warm, vintage vibes. Like, check out this bass, for example. It's also a sweet, sweet arpeggiator. And I'm gonna play a couple of the examples here when it comes to the brass sounds. It's one of the highlights of the synthesizer, but it really is good in both pads, leads, basses, whatever it is you're looking for, arpeggiations, but it has a specific brassy kind of quality sometimes. And here you also benefit from the UDS sampling. It's also cool at more of the sort of 80s ambient style. It has a soft, gentle quality to it too. And then there's this opening from Thriller. And here's another arpeggiator. Pay close attention to all the small analog clicks in it. You can really hear the UDS if you pay close attention to the little attack transients. Isn't that beautiful? So many small natural variations. It's kind of like every time a raindrop lands, it lands a little bit different than the other one. That's sort of what happens in these ones. Maybe that's a strange way of saying it. I also had two different BBD delays. So we have two analog modeled delays as well. Old school ones running side by side, creating even more fluctuations. So it's not just the UDS at a sample level, but you get all the natural delay variations too. I love that kind of stuff. But another thing I also love is its ability to shine bright. In this case here, it's sort of a pop lead. You hear it's like it's talking. This synthesizer for me is alive. It's not like your generic instrument. And imagine like an old school 80s pop song and sort of like the nostalgia in the sound, if you will. That slight detune, but the real one with the noise and everything that this aged unit has gathered over the years. And you're probably noticing that I added a little bit of retro nostalgia here on the micro pitch. It's stable when my mod wheel is down, but the more I move it up, the more unstable it gets. So sometimes we do sample the natural instability of the units, but we try to keep it relatively stable so you can control it more inside of Soundpaint. It also has an almost childlike quality to it. But I think perhaps one of the most unique qualities about it is that in each category of sound, whether it's a lead synthesizer or a soft pad, whether it's something else going on in it, everything you do, the arpeggiators have character in different kind of ways. It can also be an amazing bass synthesizer. But it's not just that it's Phat. Check when I play it a little further up here. Oh, I love that part of it when it goes like. In Soundpaint, you have unlimited directions in terms of keys, so we're far outside the natural range, but the engine will still offer it to you, so you can go anywhere you want in terms of your whereabouts on the keyboard. So that is sort of a hard side to it, like, you know, it's really showing off. But it can also be like a super quirky 70s kind of funk synthesizer. You'll get what I mean. I love the soundtrack for Your Eyes Only. It's a James Bond movie, old stuff. It had some beautiful synthesizer work in it as well. This is a little bit an homage to it. Or a Sesame Street-like flute synthesizer. Or like straight up Bruno Mars. Or Daft Punk. It also does a pretty good job on emulating things like Rhodes. good example. You know, the noise is almost so pronounced that it sounds like a drummer with a brush in behind it. And it also does the whole soft porn thing fairly well. That sounds like some kind of children's show from the 80s. You know, The Hobbit, but told in a very childlike version. The Shire. It's creative freedom being able to repeat notes without getting the same shit every time. It also does the house organ fairly well. And with this sound here, for example, you can hear that there's a natural reverb behind it. But if we go into the effects section, there's no effects on it. The reason for that is because when I sample the Jupiter 8, I have all this beautiful old school analog hardware, and I like to sample different sounds and get different saturations out of it. So there's a bunch of natural, completely clean state Jupiter 8 sounds in it, but there's also certain times where I take the liberty of running it through analog hardware and just baking it into the sound. So when you hear that sometimes where it's like, hey, the effects are turned on, it's actually because there's a release trigger in here that has all the old school information in it. Think about like The Weeknd. Or The Weeknd in space. Speaking of space, check out this electric piano here with some modulated micro pitch here where it's sent to the LFO in terms of being randomness. Just creates weird old school kind of sound. I just think of like that Gene Wilder movie Frankenstein. It's like it's alive. It's alive. It's alive. And this patch here is a good example of what exactly it is that's about this unit here. Up here, it's like trumpet-like. But down here, almost like a trombone. Real trombone. But even though this is a big sound, try to listen down here in the bass. It's big, but it's not like dominating all the frequencies, and that's one of the beautiful things about these old vintage instruments. They sit better in the spectrum. I personally think that they were designed more with music in mind. Today's sound is all about being the biggest and the most compressed. That's not what these things is about. It's about the subtle, beautiful detail. You also heard all the noise here. And you can also hear that when you let go of the key, that sound, that's the release of the original synthesizer. So we also recorded release triggers, meaning when you let go of the key, how do they fade out in their sound? There's some analog beauty to that as well. So it's really deep. For me with instruments, when they start talking, and I mean that in a sort of musical lingual sense, when they start speaking to me, that's normally when the dialogue with the instrument begins, for me at least. And did you hear those little clicks? That's not like poor editing or anything like that. That's what comes out of the synthesizer in its natural state. We call them analog clicks. It's almost like an old vinyl record, like generating its little crackles. We have something very, very beautiful coming in regards to that, by the way, but that's a different library. Let's take the next one here. I mean, how good is that for a bass? This next one is a good example of stuff that would be hard to do if you were to program in a software synthesizer with this kind of stuff. There's so much going on, kind of tape saturation of the sound as well. Hear how old school and analog it is. I mean, how detuned it is. Oh. In this next example here, check out the arpeggiator. It has so much beautiful clickbait in it. That's what I'm calling it here. Here is another arpeggiator for you. In this case, it has that old school, thinner sound with a lot of noise going on top of it. Isn't that just the prettiest thing? Also sequenced a little more of a contextual example here, a little bit of an homage to the old Knight Rider theme. In this case, just using a bass drum and a thriller bass and this beautiful arpeggiator here as well. It's difficult to go wrong when you have a beautiful 808 lying as the backtrack to a fat, beautiful Jupiter bass, added with an arpeggiator on top. It's just sweetness. In this case, I was using this pad here. And see how expressive it is on the mod wheel? From those very, very sort of muffled clicks. It's so cool. And then I had a little bit of the thriller bass on top of it. And this is really just scratching the surface of what you can do with a Jupiter 8. I think it is truly worthy of the title it has in terms of being up there amongst the greatest polysynthesizers of all time. It's more than just a synthesizer. I remember Dave told me many times that when he creates synthesizers, they're instruments, they're not just synths. And I think it's an important distinction when it comes to some of these ultra good instruments, that they're so unique, they have so many sides to them, they really become so alive in an indescribable way. I'm just in love with it, like I am with the 808 as well. And I think it's funny when you have a lot of these vintage instruments side by side, you sort of realize that they were all made with the same philosophy and the same technology at the time. And in certain ways, I would argue that technology is sometimes better than the newest shit we have today, because they didn't know what was going to happen in the future with these units, how they're going to age and all that stuff. But with computers, things got so complicated and things got so big. And in many ways, Soundpaint is a little bit in itself a counter-reaction to that as well. We want to make it easier to just make music and get the UI out of the way. I personally think that a user interface greatest job is pretty much not to exist, so I can just get to where I need to be faster. And in this case here, I've been demoing the UDS version of the library. As I mentioned in the beginning, we also have the standard edition, but you're not going to get those repeated notes that I've played sometimes here. That's the only difference between them. I like to say we don't try to emulate or simulate, but really try to bring forth the most accurate representation we can of this beautiful old vintage instrument as Stradivarius of synthesizers, in my opinion. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this journey here, and forgive me if it's been a little bit long. There's just so much to show. And again, I've only scratched on the surface here. I think we've only gone through a fraction of the programs in it. But this is what it sounds like. This is the Jupiter 8, the king of polysynthesizers, and perhaps a queen as well. So thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Bye, 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 bye.